You've built up equity in your rental property. Great, but does that have to just sit there until you sell the property? Today I want to share with you 5 strategic ways to put your equity to work without selling the rental property. We'll also talk about when you should never touch your equity. So let's get started. So why does this matter? Well, let's start with the example property that we'll use throughout this whole video. Let's say that you bought a property 5 years ago for $200,000. You got a 75% loan, so it was a $150,000 loan, and you put $50,000 in cash down for that property. Over the 5 years you've owned it, it's appreciated about 4% per year, so that brings your property value up to about $250,000. At the same time, your tenants have been paying down the loan for you, so that $150,000 loan is now about a $137,000 loan. This means that you have $113,000 of equity in that property, but how do you put that to use to continue to build your portfolio? The smartest investors know how to put their equity to work and compound in value over time, and that's how we build wealth with rentals. So your new value is $250,000, and you have some options here. Let's go through the 5 strategic ways to put that equity to work. Strategy number 1 is the cash out refinance. This is probably the most common way that investors pull equity from their rentals to then put it back to work for them. So let's look back at our example. Our property that we bought for $200,000 is now worth $250,000, and our loan is $137,000. So we have $113,000 of equity. Now, most banks aren't going to let you take out all of that equity, but they will let you get back up to that 70, 75, or 80% ratio. So if you choose to go to the bank and ask them to refinance the property, and the bank says they'll give you 75% of the current value, that means that your new loan amount will be $187,500. That means you're pulling out a little over $50,000 in cash. You've just pulled out all your cash from that property. Any cash flow you make on that property going forward is an infinite return because you don't have cash left in the property. You also now have the equivalent of an entirely new down payment for another property. So you can see how powerful a cash out refinance can be after just a handful of years of owning a property. Now, there is one caveat. The interest rate environment is very important for doing a good cash out refinance. If your property is cash flowing well, but interest rates have gone up since you purchased it, you might not want to take that hit to cash flow because that refinance will increase your payment and could wipe out your cash flow. So you have to run your numbers well. However, sometimes you buy a property and then several years later, the interest rates have gone down and you can cash out refinance and keep your monthly payment the same or even slightly lower than it was before, protecting all of that cash flow even as you pull cash out of the property. So make sure you run your numbers and you understand how the interest rate will affect you when you refinance. Strategy 2, home equity line of credit or HELOC. A HELOC is a revolving line of credit on the equity in your property. It's kind of like a credit card because the line of credit is there for you to pull from whenever you need to, but you don't have to. When you have pulled money from it, you will owe the bank interest on that money that you've pulled, and you'll eventually have to pay it all the way off. It's not a long-term option, but it does give you a lot of flexibility in your portfolio. So let's look back at our example. Your $200,000 home is now worth $250,000. You only owe $137,000 on it. So that's about a 55% loan to value. Banks will probably let you borrow up to 70, 75, or even 80% loan to value. So that means there's a difference between your current loan amount and what you could be borrowing on that property. And that's what you set up the home equity line of credit on. In our example, if the bank will let us go up to 75% of the value of the property, you could have a line of credit of about $50,000 that you could be using for other projects or in different ways. So here are my 2 favorite ways to use a home equity line of credit. First of all, it's a nice backup emergency reserve. So I do recommend always having some cash reserves for your rental portfolio, but it's nice to be able to put your cash to work in other properties or other investments. So if you don't want to be holding $20,000 or $30,000 of cash all the time, you could maintain a reserve of maybe $5,000 to $10,000 cash, and then know that you also have that HELOC as a backup if something really big hits when you're not expecting it. The second way you can use this is for short-term projects like flips. Now, maybe the amount you have in a HELOC isn't enough to cover the entire cost of buying and renovating a property, but you could buy the property with funds from a private money lender and then cover the renovation costs yourself with the HELOC. Now, why would you do this? Well, generally a HELOC interest rate is going to be lower than private money. In my most recent flip, I borrowed money from a private money lender who charged me 12% annual interest on the money I was borrowing, and then my HELOC covered the rest, and it was only 8% on the HELOC. So I was able to kind of bring my total interest rate down by using my HELOC for a good portion portion of the renovation cost. Now again, a HELOC is kind of like a credit card. It's not going to be a long-term solution, so I wouldn't necessarily use it to buy more rentals unless you have a really solid plan to burr out. So you're going to buy, rehab, rent, refinance, and get all that cash out and have your HELOC paid back down. I think that might be a slightly riskier situation. You can do it if you know you're good or you have a good deal, but just be careful. Again, it's a little bit like a credit card. Strategy number 3, cross-collateralization. I think this one is really interesting because you don't even really move money around so much. It's just extra paperwork to put a lien on your first property when you're buying a second property using the equity from your first property. So let's break this down a little bit. We have this property that's worth $250,000 and we have over $100,000 of equity in it. So if you're trying to buy another $200,000 property, but you don't want to make a cash down payment of $50,000, you might be able to convince the bank to cross-collateralize these two properties. So property A will have an additional lien put against it to basically say that the $50,000 you would have paid as a down payment for property B is here in property A, and the bank will have a lien across both of those properties. I think this is really cool because you're not even refinancing or pulling cash out. It's just that the two properties are now kind of intertwined. Now the downsides are they are intertwined. So if you want to sell property A, you can't do it without refinancing property B or doing something to undo the cross-collateralization. Also, if something bad happens with one or the other properties, they're connected and the bank could go after both of them. So I think, again, cross-collateralization is best used as a more short to maybe midterm option. So maybe you get property B and you know or you feel confident that in 3 to 5 years, it will have enough value on its own to refinance and undo the cross-collateralization with property A, or you're going to push the value and you'll be able to refinance and undo that cross-collateralization in only a year or two. I think that's the way to use it. I wouldn't plan on using cross-collateralization and keeping those properties connected for 10 or 15 or 20 years. But again, it's a really cool, creative way to put your equity in property A to use to get yourself into another investment without cash out of your pockets. Strategy number 4, use your equity to partner. So this is an interesting one because you're not selling the property, but you will be giving up some of your equity, some of your ownership in order to partner on other properties as well. So in this case, we have a property where there's over $100,000 worth of equity. Maybe you don't have cash to get into another deal you want to get into with a partner, but that partner has enough cash to get into the new deal, and you could offer them a stake in your first rental property. And now you guys will both co-own the first rental property as well as this new property. And the new property might be bigger. Maybe you guys together are able to get into a 4-unit or an 8-unit or a 12-unit because of your combined equity. It might be worth it to give up some percentage, maybe up to half of your cash flow, to then also get this other property that's going to be cash flowing as well, and just build your partnership and your portfolio over time. I think this one is really interesting because you can get so creative in how you structure it. You're not working with the bank on the partnership, you're working with an individual, and there's so many ways that you can set these things up. So definitely look into that. If you're interested in other videos about how to partner, I've got a video about several different ways you can partner in real estate, including my very favorite way, which is a tenants in common. And I think you could use a TIC agreement in an example like this, where you use your own equity to then partner on a larger deal with someone without having to bring cash to the table. Strategy number 5 is to sell and 1031 exchange into a new property. Now, I know I started this video saying I was going to give you strategies that don't involve selling properties, but hear me out. I think the reason that we don't want to sell our properties as rental property investors is because we enjoy those long-term benefits and we don't want to pay things like capital gains tax or depreciation recapture. The 1031 exchange avoids those tax hits. It technically kicks the can down the road for a while. If you eventually sold, you'd have to pay all of that stuff. But if you take these properties to the grave with you and then just pass them on, you avoid those taxes altogether. So I would say that a 1031 exchange isn't exactly like selling a property and just taking the tax hits, because you don't have to pay those things on this particular transaction. So I think this is a great opportunity when you're looking to trade up. Maybe you've got one rental property that is making you a couple $100s in cash flow per month, but if you do a 1031 exchange, you could get into a 4 or 8 unit and they're gonna each cash flow $200 per month. So you're greatly increasing your cash flow without money out of pocket because you're using the property, you already had to do that trade up. So a 1031 exchange, yes, technically you're selling that one property, but you're going straight into another property, ideally with a better cash flow situation, and you're avoiding the tax implications. So that is strategy number 5 for putting your equity to work to compound the effects of your rental properties in your life. Before we go, I want to make sure you're thinking about the times when you shouldn't be tapping into your equity. I think when there are huge market shifts that are in a downward trend, you should really tread carefully with putting your equity to work. Sometimes it's good to just sit on it and let it be a buffer in case the market has a little bit of a dip. I also think that you need to make sure that you're always going into an investment that has stronger returns. So if you're putting your equity to work, it should be in another property that's going to be just as strong, if not stronger, than the property that you're now putting more leverage on. And finally, if you're in one of those more short to mid-term strategies that we talked about, strategies 2, 3, and 4, make sure you have a really clear exit plan to unwind that situation within a year or 2 or 3, depending on what strategy you're using. Because if you don't have a clear way to get yourself out of that, you could end up in a little bit of a pickle. So it just means running your numbers, running them a few different ways, maybe talking to other investors about it. Be careful, but keep going, keep building. There's a lot of ways we can put this equity to use to continue to grow as investors and to build the lives that we want. And I hope that this video has helped you think about some ways that you can do that with your own portfolio. Equity is power, but only if you know how to use it. Please comment below with any questions you have about today's video, or if you have examples of how you've put your equity to work. As always, keep growing, keep learning, and have fun.